Depuis la découverte
Since the discovery of cuneiform literature in the middle of the 19th century, researchers have acknowledged the discovery of themes that the Bible shares with the ancient Near East, but have tried to explain how the transmission went from one area to the other. Let me give you here the overview of my lecture, a few preliminary remarks, and I will try to go up to the traditions that can be found in Ezekiel 14. And then I will be referring to the Gilgamesh epic with some corrections that I will be mentioning and that I'll be analyzing. And then we will go to the 4 agents of divine wrath that are found in Ezekiel 14. And at the end, I've brought together 2 points in one, just for lack of time, and that's the indiscriminate massacres of God between God, Erah, and Yahweh, and the role of the watchmen as agents of grace. So, when the first tablet was discovered in Nineveh in 1872, it was George Smith who discovered there that we had the direct literary precursor of the flood described in Genesis. And around 1902, so this year you have a picture of George Smith, who died early in Aleppo. And at the time, when Friedrich Delitzsch and the Pan-Babylonianism was considered that the story of creation and the flood were pale copies of the original in Gilgamesh 11. And a few decades later, around 1950, the method was outlined to explain the interdependence between these texts, which wasn't as simple originally postulated, and the notion that there's the story of the transmission of written tradition, and another term, Überlieferungsgeschichte, the history of the transmission of oral tradition. And I will be focusing more on the transmission of written tradition, and I'll give you a definition by using the method of the history of transmission of written traditions, the Traditionsgeschichte. We try to identify thematic complexes made up of the literary traditions within the biblical books and identifying the connections with other books in both biblical and extra-biblical literature. And paradoxically, Akkadian literature has a net advantage over biblical literature because of a much more precise dating of the cuneiform data and the science of epigraphy, which makes it possible to identify the school and the graphic specifics of the scribes producing the tablets. And this makes it possible to better situate chronologically, better than the Bible, which suffers from a much more significant overwriting. And when you talk about Ezekiel as the author of the book, of course, I do not believe that the book of Ezekiel is the product of a single author. Books are almost never written by a single author, but the book of Ezekiel is a collective of writers responsible for the final writing of this book. And my understanding here is that the book of Ezekiel began at the Babylonian period and was finished several centuries later. In his time, Julius Levi, in his book Nah and Rushpan, based on the graphics on the Hannah tablets. Yes, here you have them. So you have Terka just to the south of Mari, suggested that the name Nah, or Nahar, was in fact the precursor of Noah in the Bible, and that these semi-nomadic Amorite tribes were divined in this figure. And Martin Noth, who considered this notion of identification, also adopted this connection between Nah, the Amorite, and the biblical Noah, and suggested that these was probably the Amorites who had disseminated the name to the east in Mesopotamia and to the west towards the Mediterranean and Canaan. So take note of Sipar here, because you'll find the same name in Sipar, Mari and Terka and Tel Esharah, and here to the west towards the Mediterranean. And Catherine de Greff, in an article, found pretty much the same names as those that were found in Hana, some 30 kilometers to the southwest of Baghdad in Sipar. And this would tend to confirm the fact that the name came even to the center of Mesopotamia and also to the west. And all kinds of statements. For example, Wayne Horowitz and Oshima Takayoshi, who've published some 30 cuneiforms found in Canaan and Israel, so fragments of the Gilgamesh epic in Megiddo, and may be possible to postulate that a knowledge of this tradition of the flood was present even before the exile in the land of Canaan, that the scribes who were learning to write at the time were copying Gilgamesh as a part of their training course. And, for example, in the text that I will be looking at in Ezekiel 14, if you look at the three major figures there, they're all non-Israelite. It's Noah, Noach, Daniel. Notice the graphic. It's not the Daniel of the biblical book, but an Ugarit wise man and Job. So there's no need to explain, I think. These great wise men are part of the common memory of the ancient Near East. Another element, this comes from Nahum Sana, who was the director of Dropsy, and which later became Brandeis in Boston, wrote that the whole series of themes that can be found in the story of the flood were rare, but above all, the term prophet in Gopher in Genesis 6:14 was an arpax, and in fact Dominique Charpin gave a lecture 2 years ago and shows that the article in Hannah knew the term cuprum, so there was a torture of pouring asphalt on the head of the guilty, and it's the same asphalt that was used for as pitch on the ark. And so this seems to indicate knowledge of some of the key elements of the story. And this brings us back to the Sana hypothesis that maybe there was a Hebrew poetic composition before the final drafting, quite late, of the actual story of the flood. So here, this is the 11th Gilgamesh tablet. So in the end, there isn't one single story. Even if you want to talk about the flood, you have to go back and reconstitute how, from the Paleo-Babylonian period, this is passed on. And then you have the second story, which is the Sumerian story of the flood, which we have some difficulty in flooding. That's why I called it AB, with a question mark, because the Sumerian is possibly more recent. The third story is the Era story, where the date here is 850 BC. And so this NB stands for Neo-Babylonian. And then you have the tablet found in the Ashurbanipal's library in Nineveh, where the BS is Babylonian, stands for Babylonian Standard. But apparently this is a late copy of a tablet that already existed around 1200. But our copy of the 11th tablet goes back to Ashurbanipal's library. Now let's get to our text. The lines that are interesting for us, where we see the agents of divine wrath, it says, Ea opened his mouth and said, addressing the valiant Enlil, saying, you, the wise man, the valiant of the gods. And I give you the translation of Andrew George, here, who is the last edition of Gilgamesh, who brought together 184 fragments of Gilgamesh. And sometime later, Dominique Charpin published a new fragment. So, you know, there are always new discoveries to improve the reading and reconstituting the lines of Gilgamesh. So, you, the sage, the valiant of God, how could you lack counsel and cause the deluge? Now, this is a motif that reappears. He accuses Enlil, the supreme god, of having done something without having thought about it. Malaku. And this is an unaccomplished GT. For those of you who are learning Akkadian, we often try to explain to students the difference between a perfect G with a fixed and an accomplished, unfulfilled T. Now, this is the notion of consulting oneself, in other words, thinking. And so, so you did not think. And this is a motif that appears, if you look at another line, because without reflecting, he created the flood. And on line 14, right at the beginning, we read that, in fact, it was a hasty action. Their heart taken them liba labaum. This, according to Oppenheim, this is an impulsive action, an uncontrolled action. And now let's come to the sources upstream from Gilgamesh. And we're in Athrasis, so the third tablet. We see in the ancient Babylonian, we see that the motif of where there's a slight difference here. The older version talks about two gods, Enu and Enlil. And whereas in Gilgamesh it was just Enlil. And again you have this motif. You didn't think, you didn't consider. So it's an impulsive action. And this is now what he bases his accusation upon. And he says, on him who commits a sin inflicts his crime. On him who does wrong inflict his wrongdoing. And here we have, and it says, slack off, or this could be also translated by forgive, lest it be snapped. Pull taut, lest it become slack. And so it's the kind of finding the middle of the way here, one might consider. There's the sign of wisdom. And then instead of the deluge you caused, and the first agent is a lion. A lion could arise to diminish the people instead of the deluge you caused. A wolf could have happened to slaughter, and famine could happen to slaughter the land. And instead of the deluge you caused, error. Now, this is a figure who embodies a divinization of the massacre par excellence, the plague. And according to J.J. and Roberts, this is the etymology is ha-ha, which is the burning the land. For example, when you set fire to the fields, and the name is Ishum, which also means fire. And so this god has other disasters that could have reduced the number of humans. And then Enki says, I did not myself disclose the great god's secret, because Enki they had a floating ark. And so here, a very interesting text, because in Gilgamesh 11 reveals the sources. All of a sudden you have the name of Atrahasis, which comes from the previous, more ancient epic. In this case, 1,000 years earlier. And so he says, now consider what is to be done with him. And Enlil comes down and grants to only to the human, grants him immortality. And what's interesting is, as you can see, the threat, I did not myself disclose the great gods. In line 193, error, the god of the plague, and these two agents of devastation are quoted in reverse in the Atrahasis epic. And here you also have a novelty which does not appear in the older versions, where the notion of sin, and look at the question that William Moran asks. So in Gilgamesh 11, on the sinner lay his sin, on the transgressor lay his transgression. While the line tells nothing of the nature of humanity's sin, it does imply that however excessive Enlil's punishment may have been, human beings did commit a crime that warranted a punishment. The reference to sin, however, is a later addition and is incongruous with the main theme of the Gilgamesh epic, which deals with the desire for immortality and is not concerned for any ethical consideration. And this is really an excellent question. We ask ourselves, where does this notion of sin that appears, where does it come from, this in Gilgamesh 11? And we suggest as the candidate is the Era epic, which is another version of the deluge, the flood. So Era, first tablet 133, where Marduk mentions the deluge as the result of a lack of harmony in the functioning of the Etemen Anki, the foundation of heaven and earth in Babylon. The connection was destroyed, creating a cosmic imbalance, and the stars fell. That Marduk had replaced the god Enlil, the top of the Babylonian pantheon, already in the 3rd century, as Elish says. And just as Marduk is responsible for the deluge. So here you have, and in the 5th tablet, Era speaks of a former sin, and wonders what does this refer to? Is I myself undertook evil because of a former sin, and because I was irritated in my heart, I struck down the humans, and as a pillager, I indistinctly struck down the good and evil. So there's no trace of sin in the fragments that we have in Chase. Even Atrahasis never speaks about sin. But here, in the Era epic, you have this introduction of the notion of sin, and because the Mesopotamians had also developed a metaphorical understanding of the deluge to describe the major political disasters, each time such a disaster happened, it could be interpreted as a manifestation of the god Era, the god who was the chief god of disasters. But also in Atra 6, in the Babylonian, where Era is present, he is also an agent of the deluge. He opens the vaults and the valves to release the water. And I believe personally that as Era was the god of Hades, that he actually opened up the gates of the abyss. So there is a connection between Era and the deluge as an agent of the deluge. But let us move on now to Ezekiel. Unfortunately, with PowerPoint, it's impossible to show you the whole text, because otherwise the text would be unreadable. So I had to break it up. But what you need to see here is the term evil that was already mentioned. As here is seen as transgressions with lim alma al, and from a stylistic point of view, look at how it begins. The word of the Lord came to me, and it ends with Nun Adonai Yahweh. Since 1923, a study by Köhler and also Watson in Edinburgh continue to believe that it's possible to identify biblical prophecies by these stylistic evidence, where you begins, you close, and you have the oracle. And so there was this unity that was seen in Isaiah, and we subscribe to this stylistic perception. And so look at this. What's important here is if a country sins against me, it's not just Israel, but any country that commits sacrilege. Yahweh feels obliged to punish. This is a general principle. And then look at the agents. In 16, you have wild beasts. If they leave through that country, they leave it childless. And leaves with them these three men, Bad Navi, and they could only save themselves. They alone would be saved, but the land would be desolate. And the second element that you have then the sword. But what's curious is repetition of this Nehum Adonai, as if they were continually wanting to add an inclusion, and we conclude with the plague of the vermin, which is one of the symbols of error. And at the end of this oracle, you now have a kind of interpretation, probably by one of the writers who seeks to bring this general principle back to the land of Israel. And notes in verse 22, it talks about Jerusalem. This is the disaster I have brought upon Jerusalem. And so we've taken a general principle in order to adapt it to the specific case of Jerusalem. And all this is concluded by repeating once again, Nehum Adonai Yahweh declares the sovereign Lord. And here we have the president, Koama Adonai. And so all these stylistic indications show that this is the addition of an extra oracle. Now, as I said, this was in 1905, Samuel Deiches, who was the first to put in parable Gilgamesh with Ezekiel 14, but this hasn't sufficiently been explored since then. Let's move on now, because of lack of time, to my last point, and this is the indiscriminate massacre of angry gods and the need for watchmen. In other words, the notion of mitigating this anger as seen as a grace. It's not exactly a repentance, but it's a way of compensating for the anger. Now here it is Ishum who has this role of intercessor for the humans, and he says, valiant error, you have even put to death even the righteous and even the unrighteous, even the one who had sinned, Jitu. You've even put to death the one who had not sinned against you. You've put to death even the zealous priests, and you have put to death the servant of the king. You have put to death the old man on the threshold of his house and the young women in their room. And so he basically accuses king for having massacred, without any distinction, the righteous and the unrighteous. Now look at Ezekiel 21. Which is the song of the sword. Thus speaks the Lord, I come to you, and I will draw my sword, Herim, and I will sharpen for the slaughter, polish to flash like lightning, and the sword despise every such thing. The sword is appointed to be polished and grasped, is sharpened and polished. Cry out and wail, Son of Man, for it is against my people. And here Ezekiel exclaims, but Lord, are you going to exterminate everyone? Is no one going to be saved? Is only the evil one to blame? And he plays this role of the watchman with respect to divine anger. But Ishum has exactly the same role with respect to error, and is appointed with a Sumerian epithet, the Lord Night Watchman, the one who does his nightly rounds and is a counselor to the princes. And look at these two verses from the calling of Ezekiel. Mortal man, I establish you as a watchman for the house of Israel, and you shall hear a word coming from mouth, and you shall warn them against me. Now here I follow the interpretation of Moshe Greenback, where this syntagma of warning against me, and only seen here in Ezekiel, and is really someone who is to warn the humans, and there's this dangerous aspect in Yahweh and whose knowledge. And he says basically, I know I'm dangerous for humans, so better have a watchman to warn them when I get angry. And so this is where we have what different authors, including Thomas Romer, describes as the obscure face of Yahweh. And Phyllis Treble talks of the texts of terror, which has a feminist reading, which is women tortured by, like the concubine, raped for a whole night and then in the morning cut up, and pieces of the body are sent out to the various tribes. And Crenshaw also. And then you have Gunn, who wonders why Saul was rejected. And this brings you to my concluding remarks, and that is that, to my knowledge, I don't know if Yahweh actually repents, but nevertheless, Yahweh sets up a watchman, a prophet, whose task is precisely to make it possible to warn and allow the righteous to escape, and maybe to the evil one to be reformed and repent. Thank you for your attention.